Thank you very much for coming. Thanks very much, Adam, for the invitation. I have to say, it's lovely to be here. My name is Tim Phillips. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from here. I am British. And what's really eye-opening for me, actually, is to come to an event, dedicated to CBD and to come to something this size. And I've learnt a lot over the last couple of days. And it's really impressive, and I think it just kind of confirms to me the sort of opportunity for this sector and the way it's growing. So I'm going to be focusing today on international markets. Obviously, international markets look towards the US in terms of leadership, and where the US is going is often where international markets are going. But I thought it would be useful and hopefully interesting for you guys to talk a little bit about some of the international opportunities and just to sort of to tell you a bit about us and so on. I mean, I am a lawyer by background, but we've been looking at both the markets and the legal side. So I'm going to look at both today. I hope that's okay. I'm not just looking at regulation. I'm also going to look at how the markets are developing and how they're reacting to some of these legal issues that are coming up. So I'll tell you a little bit about us, about CBD-Intel and what we do. Then, as I said, I'll talk a little bit about the international opportunities for CBD. I'll focus very much on Europe, but I will talk a little bit about some other markets. And in fact, I just came back from Japan last week, and there's kind of an interesting market developing there. So it'll be interesting to talk about some of those. I'll look at regulation, particularly in Europe, and the reality about regulation outside of Europe internationally is that it's not very well developed. It's not even very well developed in Europe, so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk a little bit about some consumer analysis that we've been doing in Europe. We carry out some surveys of CBD consumers, and I think that'll be quite insightful as to what CBD consumers are looking for and why are they buying and so on. And then this last point I'll explain a bit now when I talk about us, but I will compare to another market that we've been looking at for a long time, which is the vaping market, and some of the lessons that we can learn perhaps for CBD. So a quick intro about us. So as I said, I'm a lawyer, but we are a team of 30 people based in the UK and in Spain. We have a small team here in the US as well. I have to admit that we're quite new to CBD. We've been doing CBD for just less than 6 months now, but we're very much better known doing the same kind of analysis for the vaping markets. And we have a sister publication called e-cig Intelligence, which is very well known in the vaping markets. We provide data to a lot of big international companies. We also provide data to the FDA. So we have kind of relationships on the e-cig side. We recently started CBD partly because I think it's a really fascinating area and a really interesting one, but also because there are quite a lot of comparisons with vaping, and a lot of our vaping clients, particularly the manufacturers, have moved into CBD more recently. We've seen a lot of US manufacturers certainly moving into manufacturing CBD products, for good or bad, by the way. There are a lot of vape stores in the US now selling CBD. That's starting to be a major part of the distribution channel here in the US and elsewhere. So I think some of the parallels with what's happened will be very interesting. And one of the key features, I think, of the CBD market, which is very similar to the vaping markets, is that the market growth is going to be very dependent on the way the regulations develop. This is going to be, it's a controversial area, clearly. From a policy perspective, CBD related to cannabis is going to end up with various regulations, and a lot of those regulations are not going to be particularly sensible, and you're going to get a very fragmented approach. So I think the reason why we exist, if you like, as a company is to try and guide companies through what is going to be a very complicated regulatory landscape. Despite the fact that the market is growing very, very fast, we think that the growth is going to be severely either hampered or extended by the way the regulations develop. So let's get into some of the issues on the international side. So I think the first point that I make here, so there's lots of text, but I mean the major point I think is that CBD for us is the big opportunity for the cannabis industry in general internationally. And I think it's really worth pointing that out right from the start, that Being based in the US, I think you guys have perhaps a slightly warped view of the way that globally governments and the public in general are thinking about cannabis. Cannabis here in the US has moved, the policy of it has moved incredibly fast. And you know, the way that adult use recreational legislation is coming through in the US is not matched elsewhere in the world. And I think it's really worth bearing that in mind. Having said that, despite the fact that we don't think there's going to be adult use legislation coming through in Europe or any of the international markets anytime soon, I think CBD is a massive opportunity and therefore, you know, is really interesting for an international expansion plan. Background to the market so far, well, it's very consumer driven, very similar, I guess, to the US. It's very much a kind of grassroots movement where consumers are deciding for themselves to use this product. And again, for various kind of legal issues, you know, the communication about CBD is not there. You can't go out there and say this helps medically because, you know, you're immediately then taken into a medical product. So a lot of the growth in Europe and international markets has been around word of mouth. It's been lots of, you know, internet discussion groups and so on. What it's not is about companies saying CBD is here to help you, right? So that's really interesting, and again, we'll come back to the similarities with vaping, but I mean, that was exactly the same with vaping, where consumers were out there looking for a product that was less dangerous than combustible cigarettes and found vaping, and what the vaping companies couldn't do was say, this helps you stop smoking, right? So very similar. Where are the markets that are of most interest at the moment for CBD? Well, they're, you know, understandably enough, I guess, the focus is on affluent Western countries, countries where there is a health and wellness perspective, so countries which are kind of interested in health and wellness products. We're seeing kind of, in terms of European markets, Western and Northern markets are dominant at the moment. We're not seeing a lot of markets growing in the Eastern European countries, for example. Then, as I mentioned, Asia, well, Japan is a really interesting market starting to come through. Not big yet. I don't want to pretend that this is suddenly some massive market, but it's got all the ingredients there for growth, I think, in Japan. We're definitely seeing CBD catching on there, and it's got all the ingredients in the sense of, you know, high disposable income, an aging population who are interested in health and wellness. So pretty interesting there. China, obviously, if something took on in China, then we would see you know, a massive market grow. And then there's some interest starting in some Latin American markets. Again, some of these things are very similar, will be you know, very obvious to you guys in comparison to the US, but the market is very fragmented. We're seeing lots of different product form factors coming through. We are seeing the distribution is very fragmented, so different markets, even within Europe, have very different distribution, whether it's through health food stores, vape stores, general retail, and so on. And look, quality and labeling, I mean, I know the previous speaker talked about the Wild West, but it really is in Europe as well. We've got a whole bunch of companies coming into this market. A lot of them are very good and labeled very properly, and the quality is good, but there are some that clearly aren't, and there's no kind of standards, and at the moment, no prospect of standards being developed. In terms of the regulation, well, it's clearly, regulation in general doesn't catch up with a fast-moving new market. So international markets are no different. It's the same here in the US. You know, the regulations are kind of way behind the development of the market and are trying now to catch up. And as the markets get bigger, governments are going to start looking at it more carefully, and we're going to see a lot more regulation, I think. Last point there, so I think internationally we have seen a lot of interest suddenly in CBD. I know the media writes about it a lot, and that's not necessarily all correct. You know, we all know about the Coca-Cola sort of potential investment in CBD, which they then denied, by the way. But we also have seen some definite big investments going on, and the most recent last week was Altria's announcement about their investment in Kronos. You know, they've got a minority stake at the moment, but they can take it majority, so the likelihood is they will be owning a large cannabis company in the near future. And And that's pretty interesting. So, and of course, pharma are looking at it, and we have a number of pharmaceutical clients on the e-cig side. They're definitely looking at CBD. They're very interested in it, clearly, in terms of pain relief and so on. And then we all know about beverage companies like Coca-Cola. Okay, a quick chat about regulation in Europe, and I mentioned before, I'm looking at Europe just because it's better developed in Europe than it is in many other markets. I think I said this already, but a very fragmented approach in terms of regulation. The countries don't all agree. One of the big defining features, I guess, of the CBD sector is that a lot of the regulations conflict. So you've got certain laws in certain areas of either product or whatever, and they definitely conflict with other laws. Just to explain for those who don't know, so in Europe you've got like at a federal level, you've got the European Union and various European legislation that applies, and then of course you've got country-specific legislation that either implements that European legislation or takes it further. So lots of parallels with the US, very similar in the way that that the Europeans look at the CBD markets. We have a whole set of regulations around hemp and hemp farming. So hemp farming is exempt from some of the narcotics legislation in member states, clearly, one of the major issues is what is the definition of hemp in Europe, rather distinct from here. There's a European list of particular strains of cannabis plant that are allowed. So it's not just a question of having a low THC content. In Europe, you need to actually use a seed from a specific plant, and that's got to be on a list. But given that, and making sure that the THC content of the plant is under the threshold, then hemp farming is allowed. And once the CBD has been extracted from the hemp plant, and as long as you can know, and source where the hemp plant is coming from, then it's generally considered a consumer product, whether or not it's an isolate product or a full spectrum oil or whatever. So it's generally considered a consumer product, but there are lots, as I said, of other laws that apply in each of the different member states. And as I've said there, the policy is still very much being developed. So we can expect over the next few months lots more legislation coming through in terms of this in the sector. Okay, I mentioned it a little bit. So growing, we've got an EU catalogue for the plant. So the strains have to be a specific type of plant. And additionally, the plant has to be tested at lower than a 0.2% THC. Lots of question marks around how the testing is done and so on. And I think the same issues arise here. There's an obligation to notify to national authorities in most countries, so you need to be very clear about what you're planning to do and notify. Another thing that I don't think is so prevalent here is that you're not allowed to replant the seeds, so you can't reuse the seeds, and partly that is, I think, as I understand, I'm no farmer, but as I understand, if you replant the seeds, the THC level often then goes up. So if you're doing various generations of the same seed and you start off with a low THC level, by a few generations on, you tend to get much higher THC level. So that's on growing. There are, obviously different specific pieces of legislation in each market, but in general, that is how it works. And there are, obviously it's important to look at every single country and be specific. So if you're looking at a particular market and wanting to grow there, then obviously there's more detail to be looked at. On the manufacturing, interestingly, there are a number of countries that don't allow manufacture using the flower, so they only allow manufacture using the fiber or the seeds. That's a kind of throwback to kind of hemp oil times, and as we know, right, I'm not sure whether actually that happens. I mean, most of the manufacturers I talk to say, well, there's absolutely no point. You can't get CBD out of stems and so on. So. In a way, I think that's a piece of legislation that is written in the law, but is generally not complied with. Again, evidence of provenance. So if you're buying CBD in Europe, you may well be asked for evidence to show where it came from. So to make sure that you've got all the chain of provenance in terms of the product. Just some general things about products in the European markets. Well, no medical claims. Of course, that's the same around the world. So if you're starting to make claims about your product, you immediately take it into a medical regulation, a world of pain. You don't want to do that. So ensure that you're not making medical claims. I think that's clear. There are THC limits we've already talked about. So there are THC limits within the plant when you're growing it, but also within the manufactured product. And there's generally an understanding that during the manufacturing process, your THC content will go up and above the threshold, but once you get back to the end product, it has to be back down below the limits, and that's generally 0.2%. We'll talk a bit about the regulation depending on the intended use, but of course, the general rules about extraction of pure CBD or product then conflicts often with what's going on with specific products depending on the intended use.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I may have missed it. In Europe, is there a medical marijuana law?
Yes, well, there are some rules being developed. So a number of countries, like Portugal, has a medical. In fact, lots of countries are now moving towards a medical marijuana policy. The reason, actually, I said at the start that I think that CBD as a consumer product is a bigger opportunity is more because I think the way that the medical regulation is developing is still very limited. So even within Germany, let's say one of the biggest markets in Europe, which does have a medical program, the number of patients that are registered is still very, very small. Obviously, doctors and physicians, are taking a long time to start to prescribe these products. So the actual kind of market opportunity right now is still relatively limited. But definitely there is a move towards medical marijuana. It's just that it's generally used in very limited circumstances. Look, in the UK quite recently, there was a big media storm about children who needed to get hold of medical marijuana products. And there has been an exemption that was kind of rushed through in response to lots of media storm about it. But the reality is that the medical marijuana program in the UK is very limited to specific types of problems, and so it's not a general. It's not a medical marijuana program like like we used to have in California, for example, which was much more widespread. Yeah. Good. Okay. I talked a little bit about product-specific legislation. We, I guess, look at the CBD world in terms of, largely groups of products. So in terms of edibles and oils, those are products that are ingested. There is various sets of food legislation that applies. Very similar to here in the US, there's a sort of set of laws around food supplements. Generally not overly burdensome, but they require notification. The big problem comes in with this novel food legislation. So food that was not in existence pre-97 is defined as a novel food, and it therefore requires approval. And no CBD products have been approved as novel food in the European Union at the moment. It's one of those kind of outstanding problems. It hasn't been sorted out. It'll probably be only decided when someone goes and challenges it in court. So I think that's, still a kind of grey area. This whole novel food issue is a grey area. What's actually happening in the market and the response of the market is that full spectrum is generally used to kind of to try to get around the novel food requirements, right? If hemp oil was in existence pre-97, if you say that your CBD product is full spectrum, the argument goes that it was in existence pre-97 and therefore doesn't require novel food authorization. But my view as a lawyer is that that's pretty tenuous, and whilst the authorities are kind of allowing it at the moment, we'll see. And I think there's going to be some fights around this novel food issue. Another thing that is happening to do with novel food and the food legislation generally in Europe is you're getting a lot of mislabeling and misrepresentation of what products are. So products are called hemp oil when they're actually CBD and vice versa. And we're seeing quite a bit of that happening in Europe. So, look, it's not surprising. It's the way that markets develop as they move pretty fast. But I think that that this will start to clarify over the next year or two, and I think we'll start to see some kind of decisions made around all of this. I'll quickly deal with some of the others. So flower and isolate, there's a bit of a market developing in what's termed cannabis light. It's basically flowers, products that are sold, and certainly in some Central European markets, that's really growing quite fast. So again, really interesting. I think while it remains relatively small, it's probably going to be left alone, and it's effectively not regulated at the moment. I suspect as it gets bigger and bigger, governments are going to step in and do something about it. Topicals, so creams containing CBD, are generally, as they are here in the US, they're probably going to be given the easiest ride. There is a European regulation, and European regulations apply whether or not countries specifically enforce them. So basically, that kind of law applies to all European member states. Currently all 28, and come next year, 27, missing the UK. And then vape, we track vape very carefully. Vape is generally left alone. It's generally not regulated unless, of course, it falls within the Tobacco Products Directive. Whole great set of regulations that have been developed around nicotine-containing e-liquids and vape products. Generally that's not going to be the case for CBD liquids that are vaped, but worth bearing in mind that in some countries within Europe, zero nicotine liquids are covered by this new legislation, and so there are countries in Europe that the European Tobacco Products Directive would apply, and there are various restrictions on products and so on. There is tax being developed in Europe on vape products. Generally they are only applied to nicotine-containing liquids, so they won't apply to you guys, but it's worth bearing in mind that in some countries the tax applies to all e-liquids, so it will. Okay, I think I'll move on from that. I mean, obviously there's a huge amount of detail that I've missed out, and each specific country is different and needs to be looked at. So that's kind of what we do, is really try and dig into that detail, and keep it updated because it's constantly changing. What I want to talk about a bit now is just the products themselves. So where are we with products? So we've done some work, and I wouldn't, to be honest, this was done a while ago, and it's not done on a huge number of products, but I just wanted to give a bit of a representation of how the product form factors differ between the different regions. So we've compared the UK to the US to EU generally, less the we're already thinking of ourselves as separate to the EU, sadly. I think the main thing to say is clearly that oils are dominant, as they are here in the US, and there are some regional distinctions between these different markets, but not hugely. So I think that was quite interesting. The product kind of mix is very similar across these different regions. Picked out the UK on its own, I suppose, because the UK is probably the biggest CBD market at the moment. It's much more developed than a lot of markets. But as you can see, it's not dissimilar to the way the US market splits. Again, price variation as well. We've just looked at a bit of price variation per milligram CBD in products. It's not a great piece of analysis, to be really honest, because obviously the price per milligram differs greatly dependent on the types of products. But again, you can see the pattern is not dissimilar. So we're not seeing huge differences, I guess, between the US and European markets. One of the defining features of the CBD market, and I think it's the same in the US as it is in Europe, is that there's massive there's massive variability in the price per milligram of product. We've just done some analysis. I just pulled this out for interest in the UK, just to show you some of the huge differences in pricing. Just looking across, actually this was a piece of work done in terms of looking at online retail of CBD products in the UK. We pulled out, dependent on the type of product along the bottom here, the green bars themselves are the number of products in that category, just to give you a bit of an indication. And then the lines are just the maximum and minimum prices, so just to show the range of prices. And what's, I guess, pretty staggering is that the price per milligram in all these cases are multiple times between the cheapest and the most expensive. So you're seeing huge price differences. I think that's the case. I mean, we definitely had that in the vape sector to start with, and what's been happening in the vape sector over time is that those prices have consolidated, and we're starting to see a much clearer indication of where prices lie. But I mean, you know, the delta between the cheapest and the most expensive is, you know, 10 times or more in lots of these product examples. So, you know, a massive difference in price, and clearly that's something that is very confusing for a consumer. It's very difficult to understand what you get for price, and without any kind of set of standards or a way to ensure whether or not a product is better quality or not, it's going to be very difficult for consumers to make these pricing decisions. Again, I think this just shows a bit more of the same. So we looked at oils and liquids, and then just in a bit more detail, you can just show these dots are showing where the prices are per milligram of CBD, and although there is a bit of a pattern, I mean, there are splodges all over the page, as you can see, right? So there are definitely prices all over the place in the UK market, and this is matched in most of the big European markets, and frankly, it's the same in the US, right? You've got massive price variations in all kinds of products. Okay, next set of slides are just some feedback from a survey we did of CBD consumers in the UK. We've done some big surveys. We've done 1,000 CBD users in various of the European markets, and I think it's just quite interesting to start to pull out why people are using CBD and what kind of people are they. One of the first things to say, I guess, is that the respondents we got were they were nationally representative, so it is a nationally representative sample. But what amazed us was just the huge range in types of consumers. So it's not focused on a particular age, sex, or you know, socially or anything like that. And any of the segmentation, what's really interesting is that CBD is being used by all sorts of people. So our sort of need state, in other words, why are people using CBD? The clear dominant reason is to relieve pain, and then some of these others, so anxiety, stress, and relaxation, as you can see. There are some indexing, so relieving pain seems to index a bit higher for females than men, so men seem to over-index for relaxation. So there are some kind of interesting things coming out of this. And again, with the age range, we're seeing a bit of over-indexing of stress for the under 35s versus over 35. So we're starting to get some pictures. So clearly, you know, pain is more important to over 35s. Stress is more important to under 35s. But it's just some interesting sort of things coming out. Hi.
Where does the UK get their CBD products from? How hard is it to import?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. I think it's very fragmented, like everything, I think. There are quite a lot of European suppliers that are being used by the brands in the UK, as far as I understand. It's questionable whether it's easy to import. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to import the raw material. It's harder to import a CBD finished product. So. Yeah, I think, you know, to be really honest, I think it really depends on how this develops. I can see it being at the moment that lots of companies and products are being imported without any problems. I think if this market starts to grow, then we're going to start to see a lot more focus on it with the authorities. What are people spending? Well, kind of monthly spends, surprisingly, are sort of focused on the fairly low end. So that's 10 to 20 pounds, which is, you know, kind of up to $25, $30, I guess. Again, a bit of a focus on higher spends in the under 35s and higher spends in male. So over-indexing for male on spend. Product use, well, no surprises because this kind of matches the products that are on offer, but basically the oils are definitely dominant. We're seeing a big growth in e-liquids in the UK, and that's, I suppose, not surprising in terms of partly the vape industry getting into it, but also, you know, the way that vape stores are now selling the products. We've got some kind of over-indexing of crystals, definitely in terms of younger people. So I think these crystals are going into vape often. Anyway, some interesting data starting to come out from this. And then purchasing channel, well, online really important in the UK, and actually in all European markets, online is incredibly important as a channel still. It's very underdeveloped. It's still pretty kind of amateur, I'd say. A lot of the sites are pretty kind of basic. But it's starting to move, and you can see, and it's exactly like our experience in vaping, that these sites started to get much more sophisticated. You started to get consolidation, so in terms of some of the major online players in the vape space, they really have kind of developed a big market share. So online, very important. Health food stores in the UK, that's not matched by other European markets, so it can really depend on the way that the retail environment is set up in each country. But in the UK, health foods are really important, and in fact at the moment, if you go into any, most health food stores, they'll have CBD. They'll have probably a rack of CBD products. So it's kind of interesting how that's developing. We've got some really quite big health food chains. There's a company called Holland & Barrett. It's got 100 odd health food, maybe more, 200 odd health food stores in the UK, and they're definitely selling CBD in a big way.
Could those products be, is it still a gray area where if the authorities wanted to pull those products, or is it okay? Is CBD okay in the UK? Or is it a gray area?
Really interesting question. I don't know if everyone heard that. So, is it legal or illegal? The answer is that some products have been taken out of stores in the UK, as they have in lots of countries, right? And it's not that clear whether or not it's entirely legal. I mean, that's to be really honest, if you're very specific about the law, it's not that clear, because you've got some conflicting laws and so on. So it slightly depends. I mean, you're moving from what's the black and white law and what's your interpretation of the law to how is it enforced by the authorities. And what actually happens, of course, is that various police authorities or whatever may decide that they're going to raid a few stores and take some product off the shelves. So it's still a bit uncertain, which is a problem for the industry, right? But the it's a very good sign. The national chain is exactly right, and we're starting to see various CBD products in big supermarket chains and things like that. So it's a good sign, and I think that's a very good sign for the UK. That's not necessarily matched by some other European markets. Good. There's a bit of distinction between the different types of products in terms of male, female, and age, of course. But anyway, yeah. Right, last few slides. I'm just going to talk a little bit about comparison with vape, because you guys are probably going, well, why on earth is he talking about vape, and why is it relevant? I think there's quite a lot of parallels between the way that the vaping industry grew and the way that I see the CBD industry growing globally. And I think that there's some learnings to be taken from the vape sector. What really interests me, actually, coming to this conference, is just that it slightly reminds me about the vape sector, 5 or 10 years ago, and and there are good things and bad things about that. The good things are it's really, everyone's really enthusiastic. There's lots of growth. It's really exciting. I think what hasn't happened yet in CBD, and it will happen, is that as it grows and gets more important, that a lot of regulators and policymakers will start looking at it much more carefully and start thinking about how to control it a little better. That can be good and bad, right? I mean, the good thing, frankly, is that if governments start to look at it and there are some kinds of regulations, at least there will be some kind of process of standardization, and you guys all in this room, I'm sure, are doing the right things, right? You don't want to be competing against companies out there in the Wild West who are offering very cheap products and not offering good quality and mislabeling and so on. So those are some good things. Obviously the bad things and the balance you need to maintain is whether regulations actually kind of kill off the growth and stop basically consumers getting access to product. Hi there.
You mentioned fast growth. Could you give some numbers as to give us a sense of the size of the market?
So size, I don't know if everyone heard the question, size of market and growth. And the answer is, I'll be really honest, no, I can't right now. And I don't think anyone's got a very clear sense of what the size of the market is or the growth. One of the things, that's what we're trying to start to do. So I've got some my personal opinion, for example, of the UK market size is it's somewhere between 100, 150 million pounds. So it's still really small. And I could be out by a factor of 2. So it's really, I hesitate to kind of put numbers on some of this. Look, I mean, this industry is not helped by some of the ridiculous, wild market estimates that are put out there. And particularly what I find really amazing is to read those guys who say, oh, look, 2025, the market's going to be worth X. It's based on completely nothing. And more importantly, it doesn't take into account that we're going to have a lot more regulation over time, and that's going to severely impact the growth. It might help the growth, or it might help the growth of the quality side of the industry. But look, I think it's growing. I mean, it wouldn't be mad to say that the market is growing, is doubling or more every year at the moment, at least. And if I also, since we're talking about vape, if I look back 5-7 years to the vape industry, we saw very large growth at the start of the market. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities. Back to the comparison with vape. So. As I said at the start, look, it's a consumer grassroots movement, right? People are buying these products not because they're being marketed to on TV, but because they've heard by word of mouth that it might help, and they try it and it works, and they tell their friends. So that's happening globally. It's definitely happening internationally, and it's very similar to what happened with vape in the sense that the markets grew through word of mouth. People heard about these products and thought, I want to give up smoking, I'm going to try and use that. But what they weren't allowed to be told was, use this product and you can give up smoking. That would immediately take it into a medical product, and unless you have medical authorization, of course, you can't sell. It's controversial, I said this, yeah, and Adam's telling me I need to roll up, so I'm going to quickly go through this. Controversial, yes, cannabis is a controversial sector, like it or not. CBD thinks of itself as separate from that, but it's going to be painted with the same brush, and it's going to have the same issues in many countries in the world. And as I said before, worth bearing in mind that although in the US things have moved on very fast, there's a real kind of tailwind behind cannabis here in the US. That's not matched in many other countries in the world, and it's still extremely controversial, right? Okay, I won't get into this with a legal technical sort of point. There was an issue around a precedent product in vaping where there was a product in the market pre-97 which could have been grandfathered through. It was kind of really interesting to hear yesterday in the US legal presentation that actually there's a similar issue around whether or not there's a CBD product in the market that could be grandfathered through. So a lot of similar issues there. It's an innovative and fast-moving sector, very like vaping was. Lots of big commercial interests are involved, right? So in the vaping world, you had obviously the big tobacco companies, you had a lot of countries that were very dependent on tobacco sales for tax revenue purposes and so on. Very similar to here in the CBD sector, we've got big companies that are interested in this sector and they're really looking at it. And guess what? As it starts to get bigger, there's going to be more of those kinds of investments like we've seen with Altria and Kronos Group. Medical product definition, well, we faced exactly the same issues in the vaping sector. There were lots and lots of arguments around whether or not e-cigarettes were a medical product or not, and guess what? It went to court, and it's the only way to really determine that. So I think with CBD, we're going to see some legal challenges. There will need to be some legal challenges to really decide some of these points. And this argument over whether a medical product is a medical product by design or whether it's just based on the definition of the product is going to be crucial to the way that CBD develops. Final slide. So this was just from the vaping sector, right? We've had a lot of battles, and CBD industry is just starting along this curve. Just to give you an example, globally, we did this analysis fairly recently. So how many countries currently prohibit some kind of tobacco harm reduction products, be it e-cigarettes or heated tobacco or there are various other products? Just to give you an idea of scale, so more than a third of the world's population are not allowed legally to have access to a tobacco harm reduction product. And I just want to kind of leave you with that. That is, the reality of this, and I suspect CBD is going to go down the same route. We're going to have a lot of issues with regulatory developments over the next few years, and it wouldn't surprise me if the map for CBD looks like this in a few years' time. That's it. Thank you very much.